broken.
Hello everyone, the topic of this video is bikerploitation and biker films, what sets them apart, how they differ from other genres, and their history of development. Bikerploitation is a subgenre of exploitation cinema that, while full of stereotypes, tells stories about biker gangs. Biker films, on the other hand, developed in parallel but tended to focus more on stories of individual motorcyclists or lone bikers, without emphasizing biker culture as much. These two genres often overlap and borrow elements from each other, and since they share common roots, I'll talk about them together. Let me say right away, I'm not trying to list every great film in this genre. The titles I mention are just examples to help illustrate the points more clearly. If you think I left out an important film that had a big influence on the genre, be sure to mention it in the comments. As usual, I'll begin with a comparison slide that places this genre alongside others. I've already made videos about many of them, you can find those on my channel. It's hard to say exactly when bikerploitation began. Some point to 1954, when The Wild One was released. Others argue that there was a 12-year gap between The Wild One and the next truly biker-focused film, and that the genre really started with The Wild Angels, especially since that was a true exploitation film, unlike the more Hollywood-style Wild One. Biker films, marked with dashed lines in the diagram, began in 1947, and unlike bikerploitation, which mostly faded out in the 1980s, biker films are still being made today. The color-coded divisions on the chart represent how weird these genres might seem to viewers, and if we started showing such films, how audiences might react. In general, bikerploitation, and especially biker films, aren't all that weird, with only a few exceptions. The vertical scale represents a general genre spectrum, a set of traits, themes, and key elements that help us identify whether a film belongs to a particular genre. For example, vampire films can vary greatly in tone or style, but they're still part of the genre as long as there's a vampire in the story. With bikerploitation, the key characters need to be a certain type of biker, aggressive rebels. They need to do what the audience expects from them and exist in a time period that feels familiar or believable to viewers. Of course, it's possible to send bikers into the past or future, have them fight monsters, or introduce all sorts of unusual plot twists. But in practice, those experiments don't always work in the genre's favor. We'll talk about all this in detail in today's video. But before diving into the strange world of cinema, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Unlike many film genres, biker cinema couldn't exist for a long time, simply because there was no biker subculture. Bikers, as we know them, only emerged after World War II. There's a popular legend in the US that many retired fighter pilots couldn't let go of the adrenaline rush and switched to motorcycles. Allegedly, they formed groups and started racing at insane speeds. That's supposedly why bikers are so fond of leather clothing, reminiscent of flight jackets, and why their symbols often include aviation motifs. However, there's no direct evidence to support this theory. One way or another, by 1950 the biker subculture had already taken shape. The first motorcycle clubs and rider communities began forming across the US. Of course, motorcycles had already appeared in films before that. After all, they were invented in the 19th century, and by the 1910s they already looked relatively modern. But the kind of bikerploitation and biker cinema we know today didn't yet exist. Some sources claim the first true motorcycle film was Devil on Wheels, but I watched it and didn't see much that fits. It's really a film about young street racers, and in that sense, it's groundbreaking, but their races are all in cars. The only motorcycle belongs to a police officer who interferes with their fun. So I believe the first film to really celebrate a love for motorcycles was the British movie Once a Jolly Swagman, also known as Maniacs on Wheels and Speedway. It wasn't a biker film in the usual sense, but a drama with a typical storyline for its time, centered on road racing. Interestingly, unlike many other exploitation genres that got their start with independent filmmakers, the first proper biker film was made in Hollywood. In 1947, the American town of Hollister hosted a motorcycle rally to celebrate Independence Day. But the event got out of control and turned into 2 days of chaos. The media quickly blamed the bikers, although, in reality, most of the rioters were locals. This incident inspired Frank Rooney's short story The Cyclist's Raid, which in turn became the basis for the film The Wild One. The lead role was played by Marlon Brando, one of the biggest stars of that era. His portrayal of a rebellious biker in a leather jacket helped solidify the stereotype of the biker as a troublemaker. In fact, it's widely believed that Brando's performance made the black leather jacket an iconic part of biker fashion. The Wild One introduced plot elements that would later become standard for biker films. A group of young men on motorcycles rolls into a small town, disrupts a local motorcycle rally, and one of them steals a trophy. Later, they run into a rival gang, leading to a confrontation. Real bikers appeared as extras in the film, adding a sense of authenticity to the scenes. Despite the success of The Wild One, a wave of similar films didn't immediately follow. The next notable example came with Motorcycle Gang, directed by independent filmmaker Edward L. Kahn. Kahn was mostly known for his low-budget sci-fi films, but he occasionally ventured into other genres if there was a chance to turn a profit. Motorcycle Gang is a classic story of rivalry, both for the attention of a beautiful girl and for control over the local hangout. Amusingly, it's essentially a remake of another film by Edward Kahn, Dragstrip Girl, which was released the same year, 1957. The only real difference is that in Dragstrip Girl, the characters race cars instead of motorcycles. It's worth noting that in Motorcycle Gang, as well as in Dragstrip Riot, which came out a year later, bikers were not yet the central characters of the story. They served more as background or atmosphere rather than the driving force of the plot. The true rise of biker cinema was still ahead. Hollywood approached biker films with caution. Producers understood that motorcycle culture had the potential to attract audiences, especially young people, but at the same time, it was associated with rebellion, violence, and antisocial behavior. By the 1950s and early 1960s, bikers already had a reputation as a threat to public order, largely fueled by sensationalist journalism. Still, studios weren't ready to completely abandon such a popular theme. In the end, Hollywood reached a compromise by releasing Roustabout, starring Elvis Presley. Instead of wild biker gangs, the film tells the story of a wandering musician who travels by motorcycle and accidentally ends up joining a traveling circus. In this way, the film used biker aesthetics, but the image of the biker was softened. Instead of an anti-hero, the audience got a charming lone drifter who sings songs, finds a job, and ultimately finds his place in life. This approach allowed studios to test the public's interest in biker themes without the risks associated with more violent or controversial storylines. And although Roustabout can't formally be considered a bikerploitation film, it serves as a good example of how Hollywood adapted emerging trends for a mainstream audience. The real biker explosion in cinema was still ahead, and it would be ignited by a very different kind of film, independent, rebellious, and exploiting exactly the kind of dangerous biker image that mainstream America feared. By the mid-1960s, the United States was undergoing major social and cultural changes that affected both society and pop culture. Anti-Vietnam War protests were growing louder, the hippie movement was beginning to take shape, and the biker subculture had fully formed. The media increasingly reported on so-called one-percenters, bikers who rejected the law and lived by their own rules. However, the most significant shift took place in the film industry. Censorship was gradually weakening, opening the door to more violent, provocative, and liberated films. All of this gave a powerful push to the development of what would later be known as exploitation cinema. One of the first directors to take advantage of these changes was the cult master of exploitation cinema, Russ Meyer. In 1965, he released Motorcycle, a film that combined many elements that would later become defining features of biker movies. The story follows three motorcyclists, one of them a Vietnam War veteran, who roam desert highways, raping, robbing, and beating people. At its core, it was a typical revenge film, but Meyer filled it with the visual and stylistic traits that would become essential to bikerploitation: roaring motorcycles, leather jackets, aggressive behavior, and a clash with representatives of civilized society. Interestingly, the characters in the film aren't bikers in the traditional sense, they're more like criminal outsiders who happen to use motorcycles for transportation. However, Motorcycle helped establish one of the key templates for biker films, a group of motorcycle-riding anti-heroes, chaos, violence, and conflict with the world around them. This image would soon be picked up by other directors and used in full-scale biker films, where motorcycles would become not just a mode of transport, but a symbol of an entire way of life. In 1966, the king of exploitation cinema, Roger Corman, directed the cult film The Wild Angels. This movie became one of the most iconic entries in the bikerploitation genre, cementing the image of bikers in mainstream culture. It featured a strong cast. The lead role was played by Peter Fonda, who would later become a symbol of the counterculture, and his co-star was Nancy Sinatra, daughter of the legendary Frank Sinatra. It's often said that Roger Corman became interested in making the film after seeing a photograph of a biker's funeral in the January 1966 issue of Life magazine. However, the actual photo has proven difficult to find. If you have any information about it or know where to see it, please share it in the comments. The director approached the making of the film very seriously. He spent a considerable amount of time with members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, observing their behavior, lifestyle, and internal dynamics in order to portray them as authentically as possible. Moreover, he invited actual Hells Angels to appear as extras in the film. Some researchers believe this move was less about artistic authenticity and more of a financial strategy. The bikers weren't paid, but were provided with alcohol, and the production saved on props since the bikers appeared on their own motorcycles. The film turned out to be harsh and uncompromising, depicting bikers not just as rebels, but as true outcasts in constant conflict with society. While previous biker films, with few exceptions, remained lightweight youth dramas, The Wild Angels established new stylistic and thematic boundaries for the genre. The plot centers around a biker gang that attacks a group of Mexicans, leading to a confrontation with the police. One of the bikers, trying to escape, steals a police motorcycle but gets wounded. The gang decides to rescue him by breaking him out of the hospital, during which they attempt to rape a black nurse. However, deprived of medical care, their friend dies in a party garage. The gang decides to hold a funeral for him in a local church, bringing in a casket wrapped in a Nazi flag, shocking the local priest. Things quickly descend into a drunken orgy, during which the biker's widow, under the influence of drugs, is gang-raped. In the end, the chaos culminates in a violent clash with local townspeople. Pay special attention to the final scene, where the priest has a conversation with the gang leader.
But tell me, just what is it that you want to do?
Well, we want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do.
It is often seen as a symbolic expression of alienation and defiance. Critics and scholars note that this moment not only reflects the bikers' desire for freedom but also underscores their fundamental conflict with society. The main character's response is interpreted as an act of resistance, in which the bikers don't seek social acceptance or integration, they simply demand the right to exist on their own terms. It reveals their human side, portraying them not just as aggressive or destructive figures, but as people longing for a simple, undisturbed life. But there's a catch: the bikers in the film aren't protesting with loud music or riding their bikes around at night to annoy the neighbors. They spit on the law and reject all moral norms, and for that, they get exactly what they deserve. I respect Roger Corman's work, but I've never seen his films as deeply moral or socially conscious. He made movies about topical issues because they could turn a profit, plain and simple. Of course, not all real-life bikers behaved like the characters in this film, but thanks to the efforts of the media, this image became ingrained in the public consciousness. The Wild Angels was the first film since The Wild One to portray bikers not just as thugs, but as members of a real subculture with its own rules and codes. It established the visual and narrative templates that would define biker films for the next decade. Since 1934, Hollywood operated under the Hays Code, an unofficial but effectively mandatory set of moral guidelines regulating what could be shown on screen. While it didn't impose direct bans, it strictly outlined acceptable content, including depictions of violence, torture, sexuality, and even everyday details like showing a man and woman in the same bed or overly passionate kissing. The code included 11 absolutely prohibited subjects and 25 additional, questionable, topics, violations of which could affect a film's ability to secure distribution. Formerly, films that violated the code weren't banned outright, but they were denied access to wide theatrical release through major cinema chains, which made them commercially unviable. However, by the 1960s, the influence of the code began to wane. Due to public pressure, competition from European cinema, and shifting audience tastes, censorship gradually relaxed. The Hays Code was officially abolished in 1968, but in practice, filmmakers had already stopped following it some years earlier. This turning point played a crucial role in the development of exploitation cinema in general, and bikerploitation in particular. The lifting of censorship restrictions opened the door to bolder, more explicit, and more violent films that simply wouldn't have been allowed on screens before. As a result, the biker films of the 1960s and 70s were no longer just about life on the open road. They became about rebellion, violence, sexual freedom, and an anarchic spirit, turning them into true countercultural phenomena. In 1967, Hunter S. Thompson published his book Hell's Angels, the strange and terrible saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs, dedicated to the most reckless and wild guys among an already lawless group of bikers. The book helped fuel public fascination with this emerging subculture. All of this, along with the commercial success of The Wild Angels, with a budget of $360,000 and a box office gross of $15.54 million, inspired many other directors to start making films in this new genre. As is typical in exploitation cinema, these films were shot quickly, on low budgets, and often copied one another. Just look at the posters for bikerploitation films released between 1967 and 1970. Not only do they share similar color schemes, but they also rely on the same visual tropes: brooding bearded men and half-naked women. Even the titles often reused the same words and themes: Wild Rebels, Devil's Angels, The Cycle Savages, Devil Rider, Naked Angels, Hell's Bloody Devils, Hell's Chosen Few, Hell's Angels, and that's far from all. Amid a flood of formulaic films churned out in the wake of The Wild Angels, Easy Rider, 1969, stood out as something entirely different. Rather than being a typical biker film about violent gangs causing chaos, it was more of a road movie, a philosophical story about freedom, the American dream, and its collapse. The film drew on two key ideas from Roger Corman, the biker characters from the Wild Angels and the hallucinogenic trips featured in the trip. Ironically, Corman himself passed on the opportunity to produce Easy Rider, showing little interest at the time, a decision he later called the worst mistake of his career. Instead, the film was produced and co-written by Peter Fonda, who already had experience in the genre. The director's chair was taken by Dennis Hopper, then a little-known actor, marking his feature directorial debut. Despite his inexperience, the film achieved tremendous success. Easy Rider won the Best First Work Award at the Cannes Film Festival and received 2 Academy Award nominations, for Best Original Screenplay and Best Supporting Actor. Hopper's innovation was especially evident in the film's transitions, which foreshadowed the final scene and hinted at the tragic outcome ahead, a stylistic choice that felt groundbreaking at the time. The supporting role of George Hansen, an alcoholic lawyer, was played by a young Jack Nicholson, then relatively unknown but already showing great promise. His character served as a voice of reason and a bridge between the protagonists and the hostile society around them. Unlike traditional biker films, which portrayed motorcyclists as chaotic threats to order, Easy Rider told the story of 2 freedom-loving friends traveling across America on motorcycles, though they were drug smugglers at the start. The film captured the spirit of the 1960s counterculture, portraying the clash between hippie ideals and conservative society. It explored themes of freedom, prejudice, and social alienation. As a result, Easy Rider not only became a cult classic, but also had a profound impact on cinema, paving the way for the rise of independent filmmaking and the birth of the new Hollywood movement. Most biker films from the late 1960s and early 1970s followed a repetitive formula. Directors showed the same story from slightly different angles. A biker gang rides into a new town, clashes with a hostile group, whether it's another gang, rednecks, the police, or the mafia. For example, in The Savage 7, the bikers feud with a Native American tribe but eventually team up to fight a corrupt businessman who orchestrated the conflict in order to steal tribal land. Angel Unchained, which film historian John Woolley ranked among the 40 greatest biker movies of all time, stood out for its attempt to portray the main character's disillusionment with the biker lifestyle. The story follows a motorcycle club president nicknamed Angel, who grows tired of constant fighting and violence and decides to leave it all behind. He retreats to a remote area and finds shelter in a hippie commune. The locals disapprove of the commune and attack the hippies, leading, once again, to a brawl, this time between the rednecks and Angel's old biker friends who come to the rescue. Like many films in the genre, Angel Unchained featured real bikers, in this case, members of the Arizona-based Dirty Dozen MC. Using real bikers on screen was a common practice dating back to the Wild One. For example, Dirty Denny appeared in 7 Bikerploitation films and several others outside the genre. Despite some efforts to diversify the stories, most biker films continued to recycle the same imagery and plot structures, gradually losing their freshness. It's remarkable how Italian directors were able to churn out dozens of spaghetti westerns every year, and audiences kept coming back. In contrast, biker cinema, despite constant efforts to introduce new elements, quickly devolved into a series of repetitive cliches. One interesting shift was the change in gender roles. In real-life biker culture of the 1960s, women were mostly passengers, not full-fledged club members, and they weren't allowed to ride motorcycles. But in film, things began to change. Reflecting a broader trend toward the feminization of genre cinema and the desire to attract new audiences, biker films in the late 60s and 70s started featuring female protagonists who not only rode bikes but also led gangs, avenged fallen friends, and stood up to men in a traditionally male world. A notable example is She Devils on Wheels, directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis. It was one of the first films to center on an all-female biker gang. In it, the biker women are portrayed as ruthless and aggressive, choosing men for their own pleasure and flipping traditional gender dynamics on their head. Still, that was often the only thing that set such films apart from the rest. The women acted exactly like the men. Interestingly, women in biker films didn't just star in leading roles, some also directed them. For instance, Bury Me an Angel was directed by Barbara Peters. Of course, these films were far removed from the reality of biker culture at the time, but that's exactly what exploitation cinema was all about, using provocative imagery and unusual scenarios to grab the audience's attention. Just 4 years after The Wild Angels, filmmakers began blending bikerploitation with other genres. At first, this seemed like a smart move, a way to keep the genre fresh, but it ultimately did more harm than good. It turned out that bikers didn't adapt well to settings outside the usual environment, and bikerploitation quickly began to fade. Take Bigfoot, for example, a film where bikers encounter a Yeti, or werewolves on wheels, in which a motorcycle gang transforms into a pack of werewolves. These films tried to breathe new life into the genre by adding horror and sci-fi elements, but they came off more as curiosities. Their plots were absurd, and the biker characters lost their authenticity, becoming mere caricatures. The Losers added a timely and popular topic, the Vietnam War. In the film, the US Army hires a biker gang to rescue a CIA agent from a Viet Cong camp. Why bikers? Because their motorcycles can navigate the narrow jungle paths. Despite the odd premise, the film is surprisingly entertaining and action-packed. The Pink Angels tells the story of a group of non-binary, cross-dressing bikers traveling along the California coast on their way to a drag queen competition in Los Angeles. But things aren't so simple. They're pursued by a typical biker gang and the military, led by a maniacal general. And this is not a parody. There's no happy ending. How about this plot? Jesus Christ is born again on Earth. His father is a staunch Southern Baptist, and as a teenager, Jesus rebels, joins a biker gang, and leads an LSD-fueled pilgrimage westward to take on the political elite. Troma took things even further. Known for their outrageous trash films, they incorporated elements of Nazi exploitation into Satan's sadists, an extremely provocative subgenre of exploitation cinema built around grotesque Nazi imagery, violence, and sadism. These over-the-top genre experiments were meant to shock, but they only diluted an already worn-out image of the biker as a cinematic icon. The biker aesthetic, which originated in the US, eventually made its way into other cultures, sometimes resulting in unexpected hybrids. One example is the transformation of Japanese Sukiban films, stories about delinquent schoolgirls, which, by the 1970s, featured heroines in leather jackets riding motorcycles. At the same time, crime thrillers like Cycle Psycho or the French film L'Agression began to feature bikers more as background elements than central characters. They were no longer rebels with a cause but faceless gangs of bad guys, serving the needs of the plot. In the end, it became clear that the biker aesthetic didn't mesh well with other genres. Once bikers were no longer the central focus, or were reduced to mere hooligans on motorcycles, audiences lost interest. The first depiction of bikers in a near-future setting came in No Blade of Grass, 1970, directed by Cornel Wilde. In this film, where society collapses due to a catastrophic food shortage, bikers appear as antagonists attacking a group of survivors. Their image goes beyond mere aggression. They are portrayed as ruthless predators who have adapted to a brutal new reality where strength and mobility give them an edge. Although bikers felt like a natural fit for this world, as nomadic marauders using motorcycles for looting and terror, the concept didn't see much further development at the time. By the late 1970s, Roger Corman, one of the pioneers of biker cinema, decided to reimagine these familiar figures in a far-off post-apocalyptic future. In his 1978 film Deathsport, bikers became gladiators racing through deadly arenas on futuristic motorcycles equipped with laser weapons. Despite its promise of action, the film fell short due to budget issues and production troubles. Still, Deathsport served as an intriguing transitional piece, bridging classic biker exploitation and the emerging post-apocalyptic genre. The real breakthrough came a year later with the release of Mad Max by George Miller. This film firmly established the image of biker gangs in a dystopian future. In a world descending into chaos, the gang known as the Toe Cutters crew acts as ruthless raiders terrorizing survivors, while the main character, Max Rokotansky, a former police officer, is forced to stand against them. Shot on a modest budget, Mad Max became a cult classic thanks to its striking visuals and innovative action sequences, grossing around $100 million worldwide. The film not only sparked a wave of post-apocalyptic action movies throughout the 1980s but also launched a trend where bikers remained a key element of the genre's visual identity. Even Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda discussed a possible sequel to Easy Rider titled Easy Rider of Our Time, in which the characters would be resurrected in a distant future and travel across a post-apocalyptic United States. However, due to legal complications, the idea was never realized. The Bronx Warriors, Warriors of the Lost World, Desert Warrior and many others featured the image of the rugged, leather-clad motorcyclist in a world ravaged by nuclear war or other apocalyptic events. Of course, these aggressive bands of raiders on motorcycles can hardly be called bikers in the traditional sense, but they effectively replaced the classic image on screen. Films in the bikerploitation genre were becoming increasingly rare. Organized gangs were being replaced by lone heroes like Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, whose image better reflected the spirit of the times. Or Beyond the Law, where the main character is an undercover cop who infiltrates a biker gang involved in drug trafficking. It's one of many films in which bikers are portrayed simply as organized criminals, and if you replace them with the Yakuza, the Mafia, or any other group of bad guys, the plot would remain essentially the same. In independent cinema, the image of the biker lived on, but in unusual, hybrid formats. Filmmakers began experimenting, blending bikerploitation with elements of horror, sci-fi, and black comedy. For example, in I Bought a Vampire Motorcycle, a bike becomes possessed by a demon that drinks the blood of its owners, while in Murder Cycle, an alien entity fuses a biker and his motorcycle into a single creature that immediately begins destroying everything around it. Zombies weren't left out either. Chrome Hearts and Hot Wax Zombies on Wheels added the undead to the mix. These experiments, often poorly executed and teetering on the edge of pure trash, didn't contribute to the genre's development. Instead, they turned it into a parody of itself, and only loosely fit under the Bikerploitation label. By the 2000s, Bikerploitation had finally given way to what could be called biker cinema, a kind of return to the style of the 1950s. Instead of grim tales of rebellion and violence, this new format embraced the romance of the open road, the freedom of movement, and a celebration of speed. The Motorcycle Diaries and The World's Fastest Indian are prime examples of how 2000s biker films moved away from the image of outlaw rebels towards stories about personal journeys, self-discovery, and overcoming challenges. In 2012, Easy Rider, The Ride Back was released, a film that served both as a prequel and a sequel to the 1969 original. It was an attempt to expand and retell the story of the original Easy Rider, but without the involvement of the original cast or creators. As a result, it failed to capture the spirit of the source material. The film received mostly negative reviews. Critics pointed to a weak script, mediocre acting, and the absence of the depth that had made the original a cult classic. Instead of offering reflections on freedom and the American dream, the audience was given a string of cliché scenes, bar fights, motorcycle rides, and clumsy attempts to exploit nostalgia for the original. Visually, the film also fell flat, resembling a low-budget made-for-TV movie. Noted film critic Leonard Maltin described it as a jaw-droppingly bad attempt to cash in on a cult classic, adding that it was bad in every way. Essentially, Easy Rider, The Ride Back became a textbook example of how not to handle the legacy of a legendary film. Instead of offering a fresh perspective on biker culture, it simply tried to trade on a famous name. Of course, there were attempts to revive interest in bikerploitation, one example being Hellride, produced by Quentin Tarantino. Despite its stylish visuals, star-studded cast, including Michael Madsen and Dennis Hopper, and clear inspiration from the biker films of the 60s and 70s, the film flopped at the box office and received mostly negative reviews. The problem was that Hellride felt like a stylized homage to the genre, but once again offered nothing new. Viewers nostalgic for old biker flicks had grown up and were no longer seeking that kind of cinema, while younger audiences didn't connect with its specific aesthetic and slow-paced storytelling. As a result, the film remained a niche effort and was quickly forgotten, failing to spark a true revival of the genre. Bikerploitation has fully retreated into the underground, where enthusiasts continue to experiment by blending it with other genres. Films like Dear God No and Frankenstein-created bikers maintain the biker theme but add elements of horror, sci-fi, and trash cinema. Dear God No is a brutal 70s-style movie where a biker gang faces off against mutants and maniacs, while Frankenstein-created bikers expands on that story with insane scientific experiments and zombies. These films are no longer seen as a standalone genre, but rather as nostalgic pastiches that play with bikerploitation elements, placing bikers into the bizarre worlds of trash cinema. Among the most notable recent works capturing the atmosphere of the biker movement are the TV series Sons of Anarchy and the film The Bike Riders. Both projects effectively convey the spirit of biker brotherhood, showing the inner workings of the clubs, their rules, conflicts, and evolution. However, they lack the wild fun that characterized the classic biker films. Whereas in the 60s and 70s bikers on screen could easily wreak havoc in a bar and then fight rednecks, Native Americans, or anyone else, modern stories are darker, more dramatic, and closer to reality. Sons of Anarchy is primarily a crime drama, while The Bike Riders is a stylized biopic exploring the twilight of the biker club era. Perhaps biker films are slowly making a comeback, but without the spirit of adventure that once defined them. Bikerploitation was a vivid but short-lived flash in the history of cinema. I know of at least 152 films that can be considered part of the bikerploitation genre, and that's not even counting post-apocalyptic movies. If we also include biker films, where the main character happens to ride a motorcycle, that adds about 30 more titles. In the first decade after The Wild One, only 4 films touched on the subject. The numbers grew slightly during the wave of youth rebellion in the 1960s, but it wasn't until 1966, with the release of The Wild Angels, that bikerploitation truly exploded. Still, the genre quickly began to evolve, blending with other styles and gradually losing its original themes of anarchy and freedom. By the 1970s, bikers in cinema were no longer symbols of protest, they had become part of mainstream culture, often relegated to supporting roles. Interest in the genre began to fade. The true decline of the genre began in the 1980s, when biker gangs started appearing in films not for any real narrative purpose, but purely for the aesthetic. In an effort to breathe new life into the concept, directors added sci-fi, horror, and crime elements, ultimately losing the original spirit of the genre. By the 2000s, biker gangs gave way to biker cinema, romantic tales about the open road and the freedom it symbolizes. Attempts to revive bikerploitation, such as Hellride or various festival passion projects, failed to gain much traction. In the past 20 years, only about a dozen films have truly captured the spirit of the 70s. If you want to make a true bikerploitation movie, you only need 3 things: roaring motorcycles, rugged bearded bikers, and the word angels in the title. Today, bikers in cinema are either part of gritty crime dramas like Sons of Anarchy, or grotesque genre hybrids where motorcycles are just another piece of an over-the-top narrative. But real bikerploitation, the kind we saw in the 60s and 70s, is a thing of the past, a relic of a time when the road belonged to those who lived by no rules. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you next time in the world of weird cinema.